There's a foundational belief we all seem to share when it comes to managing complex systems. We assume that absolute transparency is the ultimate fix. The idea is that if we can just brightly illuminate a system, we can eliminate corruption, guarantee efficiency, and perfectly optimize performance. The logic feels completely undeniable, right? Visibility creates accountability.
But let's look at what actually happens when we try to force that visibility into reality. Researchers from Oxford and Warwick Business School recently looked at transparency mandates that were applied to medical care. Now, the expectation was improved practice and strict accountability, but the reality? It was entirely different. These transparency mandates actually produced a massive surge in defensive, undocumented behaviors by the clinical staff. We mandated public transparency, and the immediate and inescapable consequence was an increase in hidden behavior. The more heavily they were observed, the deeper they retreated into opacity.
So this contradiction is sitting right in front of us. And honestly, it's really tempting to just view it as a human flaw. We want to believe this is merely a lack of ethics, a failure of management, or just simple resistance to change. But that's an illusion. What we're witnessing here is not a failure of character. It's an unseen structural force responding directly to observation. Something beneath the surface is shifting, constrained by the very act of being watched.
To kind of wrap our heads around this unseen force, let's picture a purely physical system. Imagine an old, highly complex hydraulic network. You've got these thick metal pipes carrying pressurized fluid through a vast, intricate architecture. Now, imagine management decides to eliminate inefficiencies by retrofitting this whole system. They replace key sections of the metal with perfectly clear glass pipes, designed strictly to observe the flow. The system is now transparent. And the baseline assumption is that the fluid is just going to continue exactly as before, only now it'll be seen.
Part 1. The principal and agent. If you look at any hierarchy, the actors inside it don't, and really can't, share the exact same environment. They have different resources, distinct timelines, and varying local objectives. A regulator's core goal is fundamentally not the same as a clinician's goal, and this creates an unavoidable structural tension. The people demanding the observation are physically and practically separated from the people executing the work, which forces a divergence that mere observation simply cannot resolve.
You see, the observer, the principal, holds the authority, but they critically lack visibility into the ground reality of the daily work. Meanwhile, the observed party, the agent, controls the localized data, the specialized expertise, and that intimate knowledge of the environment. So, when observation is forcefully imposed from above, the observed are essentially cornered. To protect their ability to actually function, they're forced into the shadows.
We actually have a name for this structural imbalance. It's called information asymmetry. It happens basically any time one side possesses superior knowledge within a transaction or relationship. And the resulting friction, which crops up when representatives inevitably optimize for their own self-preservation rather than the overarching goal, well, that's known as the principal-agent problem. But remember, this isn't a moral failing, it's a mathematical certainty. Agents will always naturally optimize for their localized survival.
Part 2. The panoptic pressure.
As surveillance increases, the whole environment transforms. It stops being a tool for clarity and morphs into a mechanism of control. Just the mere illusion of constant visibility forces the observed agents to internalize that pressure. They know they could be watched at literally any given moment. So to survive this, they strictly self-regulate. But they aren't regulating toward efficiency, they're regulating toward compliance. And to actually get their jobs done, they end up pushing their genuine, necessary activities into perverse, unmonitored channels. Let's go back to our hydraulic analogy for a second. The clear glass pipes have been installed, but they haven't changed the actual volume of the fluid. They've only increased the pressure of observation. So, as the pressure rises within those glass pipes, the system simply cannot hold. The fluid inevitably seeks a new path. It begins to find microscopic, totally invisible fractures in the old middle architecture to travel through instead. The true flow is no longer happening where we're looking.
Before we continue, I want to briefly mention a tool that really understands this difference between noise and actual signal. It's an app called Sift. Instead of drowning you in endless sensational headlines, Sift provides a much calmer, structured way to stay informed. It highlights only the most essential news, filtering out all that overwhelming noise of the daily news cycle. You can find a link to it right down in the description. All right, let's return to the mechanics of observation. This architecture of unverified observation we've been talking about is called the panopticon. It was originally conceived back in the 18th century as a prison design where inmates could be watched by a single guard without ever knowing exactly when they were being looked at. Well, the panopticon model is practically everywhere now. It forces systems into rigid, hidden compliance. The observed basically have to act as if they are always being watched, and so they consciously build mechanisms to evade the gaze.
Part 3. The measure becomes the target.
These survival mechanisms start to rapidly distort reality. Let's look at a real-world healthcare example. When hospitals are transparently measured on their ability to reduce the length of patient stays, the system immediately adapts. The rational local optimization is to discharge patients prematurely, which of course leads to increased emergency readmissions later on. The metric is satisfied. The transparency is technically achieved, but the physical reality on the ground is disastrous.
And we see this everywhere. Take environmental conservation. When a group like the International Union for Conservation of Nature uses extinction as a transparent measurement to dictate environmental protections, organizations become structurally conservative about ever labeling a species extinct. Rigid numerical quotas completely remove alternatives. They don't measure the system anymore, they just lock the system into profound manipulation.
Which brings us to the final state of our physical analogy. The fluid, under immense pressure, has now completely bypassed those transparent glass observation pipes. If you look at the glass, the visible system is pristine, it's clear, and it's perfectly compliant, but it's totally empty. The real flow is entirely hidden, traveling through the dark, unmeasured fractures of the wider network.
We can finally put a name to this inevitability. It's Goodhart's law. It was first expressed in the context of monetary policy in 1975, and it states that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Or, to put it a bit more simply, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The moment we try to transparently target a behavior, the structure ensures the behavior changes just to evade that target.
Part 4. Inescapable structural lock-in.
At this point, the system is completely locked. It cannot go back. The rational, localized demand for transparency from the principals has inevitably forced this complex network of agents to generate even more obscured behaviors simply to survive. These unmeasurable actions are no longer just an anomaly. They are the absolute core requirement for the system's continued existence. We really need to understand the profound symmetry of this constraint. Absolute transparency creates absolute opacity somewhere else. There are no villains here. There is no one specific to blame. There are only rational actors constrained by a structure that leaves them absolutely no alternative escape routes. Every single attempt to force more light into the system simply casts a deeper, more permanent shadow.
We look at these incredibly complex institutions, our healthcare networks, our markets, our governments, and when we see them producing these perverse, hidden outcomes, we instinctively assume they're broken. We demand more transparency to fix them, which only tightens the lock and forces the true behavior further underground. But the ultimate realization here is that the observed deterioration was never an accident. It was a mathematical certainty. The system was never failing. It was following its structure. And if our most vital institutions are functioning exactly as designed, we really have to ask ourselves, what happens when there are no more shadows left to hide in?